Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are taking a really thrilling bird's eye view of how English poetry has evolved over 1,000 years. We're going to trace the shifting sands of rhythm, rhyme, and reason to figure out the very foundations of the English literary canon. Now, right out of the gate, we hit a pretty massive wall. How do you objectively choose the greatest poets? I mean, literary taste is incredibly subjective, right? What resonates deeply with me might literally put you right to sleep. But rather than just relying on personal bias, we're looking at a brilliant, completely data-driven approach to actually find the definitive canon. And that data gives us a magic number, 44. We're calling this the Foundations Canon. This specific list totally removes personal bias because it relies on centuries of scholarly consensus. Basically, to make this list, a poet had to show up more than 7 times across 16 major anthologies spanning the past 4 centuries. So this isn't just one person's opinion. This is the historical gold standard for what has resonated with readers for hundreds of years. Okay, let's dive into the roadmap. We're going to cover origins to the Renaissance, then the Metaphysicals and the Augustans, jump into the Romantic Revolution, and wrap up with the Victorians and Modernists. Let's trace how this all transformed. First up, origins to the Renaissance. To really get the poetry, you have to understand the evolution of the language itself. It's kind of like a giant relay race. We start way back with the heavy Germanic Anglo-Saxon roots of Old English and works like Beowulf. Then jump to the 14th century and we get Middle English. This is where Geoffrey Chaucer steps in. He actually earns the title of the father of English poetry because he invents English iambic pentameter just to fit the unique cadence of our language. And that rhythm perfectly set the stage for Shakespeare to come in and completely revolutionize early modern English. And hey, do not think for a second that these ancient texts are just dusty relics. Take a look at this incredible modern translation of Beowulf by Maria Devana Headley. Bro, tell me we still know how to talk about kings. I absolutely love the energy here. It perfectly highlights how this ancient text about survival against the chaos of nature still effortlessly translates to our modern attitudes and cadences. So, moving into the Renaissance, the poetic form advances at absolute lightning speed. Thomas Wyatt actually goes over to Italy and brings back the strict, disciplined sonnet. Then, Christopher Marlowe takes that discipline to pioneer blank verse, creating this mighty line that set a totally new standard for drama. And then, well, William Shakespeare picks up those exact same tools and completely masters them to explore the deepest complexities of human nature. That mastery brings us right to our next era, the Metaphysicals and the Augustans. Hitting the 17th century, we enter a time of massive political tumult, bloody civil wars, and some really intense poetic rebellion. You can actually see this play out in a fierce clash of styles. On one side, you've got the metaphysical rebellion led by John Donne. His poetry is rough, abrasive, deeply introspective, and super argumentative. On the exact opposite side, you have the classical precision of poets like Ben Jonson and later on Alexander Pope. They valued smooth, rule-bound, classical rhetoric. The stylistic divide was actually so intense that Jonson literally believed Donne deserved to be hanged for breaking meter. No joke. It just goes to show how insanely high the stakes felt to these writers and how poetry is pretty much always a reaction against the previous generation. To really grasp the Augustan age that follows all that, check out this quote from Alexander Pope. He warns against poetry being correctly cold and regularly low. Pope was the absolute master of the heroic couplet, those perfectly rhyming pairs of lines you see in classical verse. In his era, poetry was a highly public, perfectly packed, flawlessly correct performance. Every single word was weighed and hugely significant. But you have to remember, this wasn't just a stylistic era. This was about sheer survival. Writers like Herrick, Herbert, and Milton were navigating the chaotic English civil wars, while Marvell and Dryden had to politically survive the restoration of the monarchy. They were using poetry to explore deep theology and public debate in a highly dangerous world. Eventually, though, society gets tired of strict rules. Welcome to Section 3, the Romantic Revolution. The Romantics essentially executed a seismic shift against the scientific, empirical worldview of the Age of Reason. They completely traded public rhetoric for private introspection. They threw out the strict formal rules and brought in conversational language. They essentially abandoned city life and pure logic to return poetry to a visionary state, intensely focused on the natural world and the untamed human spirit. For perfect taste of what this actually looked like, let's look at the so-called peasant poet, John Clare. He writes, 5 eggs, pens scribbled o'er with ink their shells, resembling writing scrolls which fancy reads as nature's poesy. Imagine replacing a grand epic poem about a king with a poem about a tiny bird's nest. That was the radical, democratizing power of Romantic poetry. He's literally taking the reader on a walk through the countryside, just marveling at everyday beauty. Of course, Clare wasn't alone. This era is packed with absolute heavyweights. While Blake and Wordsworth laid down the visionary groundwork, the younger generation, guys like Keats and Shelley, pushed it even further. They used incredibly sensuous imagery to grapple with deep anxieties about mortality and the white-hot power of the human imagination. Now, as the world rapidly industrializes, we hit our final eras, the Victorians and modernists. As things speed up, poetry completely splinters into bold new forms, and that splintering completely exploded over in America with Walt Whitman. He wrote, "I guess it must be the flag of my disposition, out of hopeful green stuff woven." Whitman just shattered traditional meter. He invented this incredibly expansive, uncontained free verse to explore democracy, the self, and nature, and basically became the quintessential American poetic voice in the process. Back across the pond, the Victorian era is defined by extreme, beautiful variety across a massive spectrum. You've got Tennyson capturing the grief of an entire nation, while Emily Dickinson isolates herself to explore the inner mind through these revolutionary, jagged slant rhymes. Meanwhile, Gerard Manley Hopkins is literally inventing something he called sprung rhythm, just to capture the chaotic, ecstatic patterns of natural human speech. But then, the 20th century happens, and it violently changes the very purpose of poetry. Read this quote from Wilfred Owen. "My subject is war, and the pity of war. The poetry is in the pity." Modern, mechanized warfare entirely stripped the ancient concept of glory away from the battlefield, and it forced poetry into brutal, stark realism and immense human tragedy. Which brings us to the modernists. They're staring down a fractured post-war world, and they reflected that brokenness right back to us. They used fragmented language and really jarring contrasts, like putting freezing brooks next to deserted modern airports, just to capture the total alienation of modern reality. So what does this all mean for us today? After 1,000 years of rebellion, reinvention, and completely shifting tastes, which poet actually defines our current era? Poetry isn't just history, you guys. It is a living, breathing reaction to the world right around us. Keep exploring this canon, because honestly, the next great poetic shift is probably happening right now. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I highly encourage you to go out and read some of these incredible voices for yourself.